So today's session is titled COVID-19 and After, Transport Appraisal and Planning in a Time of Imperatives. I'm not going to say much more other than, Phil, you're going to speak for about, I believe, 17, 18 minutes. And then what we're really hoping for is a really discussion between everyone, not a question and answer kind of formal session. You know, if everyone's got quick questions specifically on what Phil said, by all means. But over to you, Phil.
And I'll start with what everybody knows and then move on to what perhaps everybody hasn't thought through yet after we've scoped it out. What we are unexpectedly doing is living in the middle of the most extensive changes in travel behaviour possibly ever. Everybody is speculating about the longer term effects. I'm going to start with a quick summary of my own speculations. They're nothing more than that, but they form the base of where I start from. Most obviously, air travel has taken the clearest hit. I'd say this is certain to be a long-term reduction, and it possibly may even represent the start of a declining trend. Equally obvious at the other end of the scale is that there has been an increase in the role of walking and cycling and commitment in some places to expanding the provision for it. There's been a huge reduction in car use. Surveys have shown that there are substantial numbers of people who say that they welcome the reduction of their own car use with intentions to continue that. However, other surveys have reported that non-car users are saying they are now thinking of getting and using cars. And these two statements are almost certainly both true. Similar churn occurs even in normal times. I'd expect this collision of opposite trends to continue and possibly sharpen. The battleground is about allocation of road space, including pavement space, and there'll be more assertive pedestrians influenced by the astonishing shared experience of clear skies and quietness and purer air, for some people for the first time in their lives. And there'll also be more reassertive drivers. The behaviour patterns of SUVs in urban streets and pavement parking will not disappear spontaneously. And that suggests that there'll be a greater diversity of outcomes in different places. Buses and urban rail have both been very badly hit and will continue to be by distancing, fears of proximity, and again, the experience of not putting up with overcrowding and unreliability and not wanting to return to it. However, the superiority of public transport over cars in efficient use of road space will continue, especially in urban areas, because public transport supported by cycling and walking can deliver livable cities even with loading factors changed by physical distancing, but cars can't. But that, I think, will not be uniformly apparent. On the planning side, there's a line of argument saying that the case for increasing density has disappeared and that low density suburbs, implicitly car dependent, are the future. A new argument for intelligent density is starting to emerge, and it will be crucial. So what we're having is a boost both to the Paris concept of the 15-minute city, a return to local provision of services with short distance travel being primary, and also a return to trends to suburban and pseudo-rural living, low densities, long distances, and car dependence. And in summary, I'd expect a future of simultaneous contradictory and inconsistent trends, different things happening in to different people, different places, social groups, occupation, age groups, and so on. Now, I don't think that's the same as saying that we are uncertain about which of the two main directions will happen. The near certainty, in my view, is that they both will. The uncertainty is which will win and where, and that's not about forecasting, it's about policy. So that's my view of the context. The overall effect is going to be that the prospects are more complicated, with both the positive and negative possibilities more sharply defined. So that brings me to my central point, which is what happens to the idea of a planned future implemented by evidence-based, elaborate, formal appraisal rules and analytical methods. TAG, formerly WebTAG, and its offshoots. These procedures were codified over half a century ago in the 1960s and have been very influential, especially in consideration of traffic congestion and of the choice about whether it's more economically efficient to treat that by road building or by road pricing. It's been less influential in considering regulation, which I'll come back to. At the heart of these methods, all such analytical evidence-based methods, is the concept of trade-off for both individuals and policymakers, analytically weighing up the costs and benefits of alternatives against each other to see what's worthwhile. And what has been happening in the last 30 years has been a more complex view of behaviour and a progressive widening of the scope and objectives in such ways as to put pressure on that analytical framework. The objectives have been contesting the dominance of car-based personal mobility, in spite of that having been what the market has produced. A wider consideration of pollution and health and quality of life and equity, of the economic viability of local communities, of equity and the global climate. And the flaws in solutions based on endless expansion of road capacity have become better understood, as have been the core alternatives, mostly seen in terms of a well-rehearsed debate about public transport and active travel modes, fairer pricing, reallocation of road capacity, traffic reduction, land use planning, and the limitation of technological solutions. And in all of that, the formal calculation of benefit and cost trade-offs, BCRs, have been influential but not decisive. This, I think, has partly been due to the effect of uncertainty on the intellectual credibility of forecasts of a most probable future. Uncertainty has required consideration of the possibilities of alternative credible scenarios, including both high traffic growth and low traffic growth, even traffic decline, to be able to make judgment about the robustness of schemes and projects and interventions under different possible futures, and therefore a move from forecasting the future to choosing what sort of future we want. And this was already happening well before coronavirus added to the mix. So it's ironic that at the same time as uncertainty about the future, there's been a distinct move to its opposite, that is imperatives. And my thinking on this was triggered by the legal ruling on the proposed third Heathrow runway, saying that the proposal cannot go ahead because the formal appraisals, huge and voluminous though they were, had not complied with a legal requirement to take into account a legal commitment on carbon reduction. That commitment, in effect, according to the courts, took precedent in terms of card games. The law trumped the calculations. And the underlying point on that is that abiding by the law is not itself a trade-off to be weighed in the balance, but an imperative. You'll have noticed that an independent environmental group, the Transport Action Network, has started preliminaries for a legal challenge applying the same logic to the road programme. It's worded in legal terms on which I'm not really qualified to comment, and I won't. The courts will decide on that if it goes so far as to go to court. But in parallel, there's a technical argument about the way in which carbon has been treated in the formal appraisal of the separate road construction proposals. And these appraisals have all concluded that the carbon impacts attributed to the projects have an economic value many times smaller than the value attributed to their estimated time savings, and are so small that they are insignificant in relation to the net zero target. And that raises, obviously, a substantial credibility problem about how the biggest road programme ever can be compatible with the most ambitious carbon reduction programme ever. A carbon reduction which is treated in policy not as a trade-off, but as an imperative. Now, my own technical view is that the actual volume of carbon effects of major road building has been understated, and so has its value. So if these two calculations were changed, the scale of the carbon effects and their value, it might well be that a reappraisal of the road programme, still using essentially the same analytical framework, would show that the road programme does have a significant effect at a high economic value and reduces the possibility of achieving the target carbon reductions. That's what I think. My own advice would be that the Department for Transport should undertake such a reappraisal, even if it were not instructed to do so by a court, because this part of the argument, the technical argument, does not succeed or fail according to a legal ruling, but according to the technical validity of the methods used. And it can still apply whatever the ruling. Even if the method used is legal, it can still be mistaken. And conversely, even if the technical calculations are valid, they could still be illegal if the process has been faulty. But in either case, it's time, I would say, for a reappraisal due to the combined effects of new dimensions of uncertainty about the demand trends, different judgments about future needs, legal questions, and imperative. The experience we now have is that crises don't go away if they're ignored. But the underlying paradox remains. Should carbon be put into the detailed constrained benefit cost ratio at all? Policies which have the character of an imperative need to take precedence over the calculation of trade-offs. When such a policy is determined, it becomes not a trade-off, but a filter, even if cost-benefit calculations have been used in assessing the policy in the first place. Then you rule out certain acts and projects before formal appraisal. It's a prior stage, simply because they conflict with the imperative. In this case, you simply would not seek solutions from investments which increase carbon emissions, but seek alternative ways of solving the problem. And the interesting thing is that that's not as unusual as you'd think. Regulations determining standards for the emission of noxious emissions, or which are done for reasons of basic safety tests on vehicles, are simply regulations. One doesn't allow a cost-benefit appraisal about whether they should be followed or not by individual actors. The same is done for regulations as simple and basic as which side of the road you drive on, or it can be done, though it often isn't, on about parking on pavements. It's not a revolutionary destruction of rational planning to assert such standards, but a practical way of implementing rational planning. And at a different scale of activity, think of the treatment of the big problems of modern history, of slavery or child labour or forced marriage or famines or plagues or racial discrimination. All of these have economic consequences, but we found different ways of determining what to do about them than submitting them to an economic benefit cost ratio. To return to the example of coronavirus, in the early stages, there were indeed some discussion using the language of trade-offs. Was it really worth trying to protect everybody when a more cost-effective approach, better for the economy, would be to let infection proceed unchallenged, building up herd immunity? When the scale of the death rate that was likely to follow that approach was estimated, the approach itself was rejected so emphatically that no political figure or their advisor now admit they had ever even considered it. The main decisions affecting lockdown, economic activity, budget, and treatments have not been treated as trade-offs, but as imperatives, constrained only by science and practicalities. I would say that what we now have is a situation which is quite different in nature from what it is before. We will be required to consider a large program of events, decisions, and policies under the criteria of imperative, not as trade-offs. And it changes the way we think, and it changes the possibilities of what we do. One thing we should say is that this is not a blank check. We cannot allow simply the assertion of imperative to mean that all questions of rationality are pushed out of the window. That would bring an entirely different meaning of the word trump into play. It's not a blank check. We have to consider at what level of public support we use the criteria of imperative to determine what we're about to do. But on some of the biggest factors which confront us, and climate change in particular, I think that has to be the way forward. So that's all from me. I look forward to your views. I'll see if I can turn this back so I can hear you all again, and we can start the proper discussion.
Hi, thank you, Phil. That that was very interesting. I wasn't familiar with where you were going to take that discussion, so it was a very informative and thought-provoking. We've got the text facility. Can everyone hear me okay? Yeah, we've got the text facility going. So people, if you want to kind of raise a point in this, probably that's the easiest way, just to write something there, or even just say, Andrew, can you ask me a question or whatever, or to start the discussion, because I can't probably see all your faces on screen. So it's not like being in a classroom with people putting their hands up. Phil, what you said raised so many thoughts in my mind. They're all a bit of a jumble right now. But I guess one of them might be the use, the thing about the imperative. I just wonder, when policy is framed at a level like it has been on climate change, which hasn't, I think it'd be fair to say, it's not involved the general public in a very considerable way. Net zero was rushed through Parliament last year, and I think we shouldn't forget the reason it was rushed through was really to give Theresa May a legacy, and I find that quite a hard one to accept, that is why we are all now pursuing this. And I understand there were reasons on scientific advice too, but you know, a big part of it was Theresa May wanting a legacy. I just wonder whether the public hasn't realized what the implications of that are. And when you suggest that it is now an imperative and therefore it means blanket changes in policy and things we can't do, for instance, we can't build airports or expand airports, or we can't perhaps build roads, there must then become a clash between the people who have made this the imperative and the general public, and a lot of politicians as well, who suddenly realize that, wow, we didn't realize this was the implications of what this imperative was. And I wonder whether you would then have to have a debate really about, are we prepared to sacrifice these other objectives? I know it's a bit of a ramble, but maybe you want to say something on it.
Well, I think one thing that needs to be said is Theresa may be an important influence on the way in which the specific decision was taken in the UK, but that hardly explains a trend affecting the whole world. It's not a case that every single country has had an odd decision taken by accident because of their versions of Theresa May. But you're quite right in an underlying point. The application of imperatives depends absolutely on a very high level of public support and understanding and signing up to that. Otherwise, it simply doesn't work. It becomes dictatorship rather than rationality. So I am talking about the situation where there is large-scale public understanding and sign up to, as there has been with lockdown, as we well know, and as surveys suggest is also the case in terms of climate change. We may have different assessments about that, but it does, I'm sure you're quite right, that it depends on that in order to be able to succeed.
Okay. There's some questions I've got up here. Steve Gooding, do you want to come in? From the RAC Foundation.
Sure, but I'm sort of wearing my old hat as well a bit, because I think, I just wanted to say, we could all spend quite a long time, indeed I have, on the ills or otherwise of WebTag and what it does and what it seeks to do and how it's used. But at its heart, and I've just been looking at the relevant page, WebTag says, you shall capture the carbon impact of what you're proposing. You shall value it at the value that the government tells you to. What it doesn't say, at the end of that is, and if the value you come out with is outweighed by some other value that we've told you to put in the equation, you must do the following. And I have, in my time, spent time with ministers explaining that the appraisal informs your decision. It doesn't dictate it, and it doesn't constrain it. And I think what I take from what Phil was saying is it is entirely possible and plausible for the real policymaker, the minister here, policy advisors are different, but the policymakers could say, we're just not going to look at things that make the carbon situation worse unless and until we've got our net zero carbon strategy totting up so that we're completely confident we're going to hit it. They could say that. At the moment, I don't think they are. And I think the thing that we're sort of circling around here is sometime over the next 12 months, we've got a tension between saving the planet and reboosting the economy. And for those of us who have a look at the New York Times most days and watch what Donald Trump is up to, it's quite interesting to really see that tension being played out day by day, not just in this country, but across the world.
Interesting. Okay. Who wants to come in there? That's an interesting point Steve's made there. Does anyone want to add to that?
David Metz, can I comment?
Yeah.
I mean, the thing about the new red investment strategy is that there is no economic content or impact analysis. It's really a program of expenditure, about half of which is on maintenance, which you could argue is sensible, and the other half is on new capacity. But because civil engineering is so expensive, you get very little new capacity. Indeed, in recent years and for the future, the addition of lane miles to the strategic road network will barely keep up with population growth. So in fact, the carbon impact of this program may be less, particularly when you build into it the government's commitment to phase out the internal combustion engine for cars and vans by 2040. So the full analysis of this program needs to be done, and I hope the department will do it in enabling to respond to the legal challenge. But more generally, we need to think about not just transport in isolation, but the whole range of interventions, technological and other interventions that will reduce carbon emissions. And the strategic approach to this, which has been used, is called looking at the marginal abatement costs of carbon, looking for the whole range of possible policies and technologies and asking what is the cost to abate carbon emissions of 1 ton, some common denominator. And then you can order these and you can quantify their contribution. And when this has been done in the past, including transport elements, it is the basis for making a decision about the overall policy. So we shouldn't be focused narrowly on a particular road program. We shouldn't even be focused on transport. We need to look at the whole range of policy and technological interventions that may help meet the net zero carbon emission target. So this is a cross-government effort that now needs to be done in order to inform policy.
It seems to me that treating it as an imperative above every other objective, to me, it strikes me as a narrow way of looking at things. I mean, there are going to be some road schemes that are good and some that are bad. And if you use appraisal methods, you can look at the different impacts and you can say, okay, in this one, we're going to trade off jobs and economy versus the environment or whatever. Whereas if you treat it as an imperative and you suddenly say, right, we can't have any new roads. I find that a difficult thing to comprehend on such a fundamental part of policy as infrastructure provision. You could say net zero on a global level is necessary or whatever, but we probably, if we are being realistic, we'd probably know that a lot of countries are not following it in the same way that we are. And that would have to come into a discussion, would it not? Anyway, let's look at someone else who's got some points on. John Elliott, do you want to come in? Is John there? If he's not, then I'm going to go to Neil Chadwick. Neil.
Hi, Andrew.
Yeah, hi, Neil. You come in. You've got some interesting reflections.
Yeah, I mean, just first of all, I agree totally with Phil that the way that we value carbon in cost-benefit analysis is almost certainly wrong. And that's for two reasons. One is that the value of carbon is almost certainly too low because essentially it was set when we had an 80% target and now we've got a net zero target. So the actual value doesn't reflect the target. And also it was set well before all of the work that's gone on recently about the importance of the carbon trajectory and the need to reduce carbon rapidly in early years. So that the valuation's wrong. And also the way that carbon's calculated in Tuba is also certainly wrong because what it does, Tuba does, is calculate the average speed between two zones, and of course no cars actually travel at the average speed, and the carbon emission curve isn't proportionate to speed. So those calculations are wrong. However, that wasn't actually the main point I was making. I think we do have some imperatives when it comes to emissions, and that relates to air quality. There are legal limits to air quality, and all of those folk across the country are busy going away looking at clean air zones is to meet that legal limit. And there, actually, what you're doing is not trying to, when you do the economic case for that, is effectively a cost effectiveness analysis. So what is the minimum cost way of meeting the legal limit, recognizing that in welfare terms you might actually end up with a disbenefit. So actually what you're trying to do is minimize a disbenefit in a cost effectiveness analysis. But when it comes to carbon, it's not a gross zero target, it's a net zero target. So any net target is going to be made up of a number of positives and a number of negatives. And I can't see any way that we'll ever operate a transport system which is gross zero emissions. So the question then is actually what are our carbon sinks that are going to compensate for the carbon emissions that's inevitably going to be part of the transport system, even with the government's commitment to phase out sale of new internal combustion engines. There will, for private cars, there'll still be elements of the transport system that are operating on some fossil fuel somewhere, some ferry in the Western Isles or something. So I think my point is actually, I think the imperative position that Phil is arguing doesn't actually reflect the policy position that we have related to carbon.
Okay. Yeah. Who wants to come in on that?
I could come in a bit on that and my other point. Yes, I'm sort of on the same lines. An imperative does mean there's some pluses and some minuses, but a firm filter should make schemes that do the wrong things not get through very easily. They've got to have absolutely staggering benefits in other areas to counteract that. The other thing is we could keep the present system if we put a negative or put those things on the other side of a curve. Most authorities are after another filter, reduce peak hour car commuting. Certainly RIS2 will increase peak hour car commuting, but we could put time savings for peak hour car commuters as a cost rather than a benefit to a scheme quite easily. And that would change things quite dramatically. So that's one thing. GLC, for my sins, I was in charge of scheme appraisal back in the 80s, and I've probably forgotten most of it. But if Michelle Dix is around, her memory will be better than mine. And the GLC had criteria by which schemes would be assessed. And they were filters that said if it did that, it wasn't acceptable. And there were a range of those that I've forgotten and probably could find somewhere in my loft, but that's all. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Steve Gooding, you're just coming back on something there about David. Have you got something to add on that? from David Metz's comments?
That's okay. I'm just trying to unmute my microphone again.
Okay.
No, well, I was just saying, I think that I'm inclined to agree. I mean, David and I have notably over the past discussed some of our differences of view, but I have to say it pains me that we don't have an overarching national strategy that pulls together the various elements here. And most obviously, we have an air quality strategy and we have a carbon strategy. And I don't think I'm the only person who finds that just gives them a headache. I don't get it. I think they're linked, they're not the same. Something you do for one of them, as we famously know from all the stuff about diesel, could easily make the other one worse. I think we do need to have a sense of what overarching is, what we have national government for, after all. What is the overarching picture? What is the sort of direction we're going in? And then you can start looking at individual schemes. And I think the defence of the road investment strategy enhancements is we've got to start from, well, people would say maybe we'd start from where we are, where we were, which was we were already way over capacity on certain of those links already. But it begs that other question, and if only SG1 from the Foundation was on the call as well, he'd be saying, the one thing is about what's the capacity of the infrastructure, and the other thing is what about the constraints that apply to the decisions of people driving the vehicles using it. And again, we need to have both of those things in play. And at the moment, I'm seeing a lot of infrastructure capacity debate, which is almost sort of the acceptable face of this, of the Mayor for London saying, I'm going to repurpose large swathes of road space to walking and cycling. But perhaps still nothing very much on how might we influence people's choices as we come out of the COVID lockdown. If at the point we do that, petrol and diesel is at an all-time, not quite all-time, but a massive low in comparison to what we've been used to for the last 5 years.
With your previous hat on, Steve, you were formerly DFT Director General Roads, is it? I think.
Yeah.
Yeah. If you were still in that position today and you were looking at the case brought by the Transport Activists Network on climate grounds against the road investment strategy, what would you be thinking, and what would your message to ministers be?
Well, I think in the first instance, I'd be thinking, as someone else has observed in the chat, that there's a national statement, national policy statement, the national network's national policy statement. Am I robust to somebody saying that the NNPS is invalid because it predates the Paris Agreement or it predates Theresa May's net zero carbon target or not? So I'd have somebody looking at that. I would be saying historically, we've discussed this, Roger Geffen and I've discussed this. We look at road schemes on their individual merits. There's a question mark here about how they all add up together, but at the moment, that's how we go about it. And then I'd be looking down the list and thinking scheme by scheme, because when you look into that enhancement list, again, Phil was absolutely right. Half of that road investment strategy is about the health of the existing network, and very rightly so. The other part is about enhancing that network in some means or other. And I'd be looking down that scheme by scheme. And a lot of the budget is taken up by some very flagship headline schemes like Stonehenge, like the Lower Thames Crossing. Other ones like Black Cat to Caxton Gibbet, I think I could pretty well defend regardless. I can see Martin Tugwell smiling there. I think I'd be on pretty safe ground. Right.
Do you think the overall environment of roads policy making is much more complex with the addition of net zero than perhaps in your day when that wasn't there?
I don't think it's more complex. I would say that when I came back into the department in 2004, the general feeling was against road building. I mean, I certainly would say Alistair Darling was the Secretary of State at the time, and he frequently heard saying, we live on a small and crowded island, we're not going to build our way out of our problems. I would say that coming out of the lockdown and moving into whatever the new normal turns out to be, I'm hearing a lot of people stating things that they think are self-evident, not on this call, I should say, but people are saying it's perfectly clear this is what we need to do. And I'm not sure that they're bumping into the local elected members or the backbench members of parliament, for whom kickstarting the economy means opening the window in the morning and hearing the jolly sound of traffic.
Okay. Right.
Could I just pop in quickly?
Yeah.
Andrew?
Hello, Tim.
Hello. This is not really relevant to the thread that's developed, but John Elliott mentioned that the GLC back in the 80s had a set of criteria for judging road schemes. And just like to point out that I wrote those. And by some extraordinary coincidence, yesterday I found it in my file and I put it up on my website. So just, it's a bit bizarre to hear.
Excellent. Oh, well, so people can see it there.
Yep, indeed.
Climate presumably wasn't mentioned.
I don't think so.
Okay, right. Let's see. It's John Dales. John, you've written something just on that message there. I don't know. Do you want to come in on that? It might take a while for people to read and digest.
What, you mean I went on a bit long?
Yeah.
I have never done such a thing. So I shall now blow my nose. Yeah, it's simply actually I'm intrigued by, prompted by your reaction to what Phil said, and this idea of, as I said, you published an article by me a couple of months ago, which quoted Herman Daly. I think it's something like the father of environmental economics. In other words, he's probably the only person who's ever commented on that. But this phrase he had about the economy being a wholly owned subsidiary of the environment, and I suppose the thing that strikes me about that is the matter of timing, which is there's obviously a short-term jobs now kind of imperative for economic recovery, but if we're not careful in terms of the broader environmental picture, it's the jobs then that are really at risk by not managing the carbon emissions from transport, and indeed all other sectors. And I suppose the thing that struck me about that is that it's really complicated by time. Mm-hmm. And so that thing of, right, what do we need to do now to make sure we have jobs tomorrow? And even if you were prepared to sacrifice all that, and I'm not, some might be, because of the Mother Earth, for want of a better phrase, there will come a point when actually we can't just keep doing that, because it's where short-termism means long-termism. And I think one of the things we're becoming increasingly aware of now is that the long-term that we thought, the long grass into which we put climate change well, I'm sorry, there's a danger for our metaverse here. The grass is getting shorter, Andrew.
Okay, someone's been out mowing.
Yeah, so that's hoving into, that's a lot nearer in view, and therefore this matter of it's still, as I view, and I think it was Nick who was talking about the idea of net. We are talking about net, and there will be a need to do that, but actually we have to, these things I think, and I don't know that it's as Phil commented, it's not just Theresa May's sort of sign off, is we need to be continuing to work so that the curve is getting flatter and flatter, essentially. And we have to do that in a way that that responds to the short-term needs, which does make it extremely complex. But it's just that matter of timing. I think it's not environment versus the economy. It's, if we're not careful, if we focus on the short-term economy, which my personal view is always the problem. We have businesses that only have to work, the focus of people who run a lot of businesses next year's AGM.
Yeah.
And well, focus of most politicians is 4 years' time maximum.
Yeah, the Committee on Climate Change has written the letter, which is available on their website yesterday, to government on how the country can recover from COVID-19 on a climate-friendly basis, in terms of identifying areas of job creation, etc., which should be kind of growth areas.
Yeah.
Roger,
I'll look it up. Thank you.
Have a look at that one. Yeah, Roger Geffen, you've made a couple of comments here. One responding to Neil's point. Do you want to just come in again?
Yes, thanks. Let's just start with that one because it's sort of fresher in the mind and it relates to some what John was saying. There is also a problem with, and John, David Metz may correct me if environmental economics methodologies have changed, but as I recall them from when I was studying this, part of it was environmental economics involves finding out what people are willing to pay to either to have an environmental good or to avoid an environmental bad. And there was an inevitable problem with climate change, which was the difficulty of how on earth do you ask future generations or other creatures, for that matter, what they would pay to avoid living in a completely destroyed climate in which human civilization just wasn't possible. So that, I think, is part of, as I understand it, why environmental economics undervalues carbon savings. Just to the other point, if anyone wants to update on that, I'm open to correction on that one because my knowledge may be out of date. But the other point I wanted to make was about this, what David Metz was saying earlier about the appraisal of the roads investment strategy as a whole rather than individual schemes. Now, the fact that this has not been done, as I think both Phil and David had made the point that it in itself is problematic, regardless of what the law might say on this. We just don't know what the overall impact of the programme is. Yet the whole thing effectively gets development consent orders for every scheme get waved through. The government gets to give itself development consent orders on the basis of a strategic environmental assessment that was written in 2014, the National Network's national policy statement. Despite the fact that in turn was written before we even set the 4th and 5th carbon budgets, which we're now on course to not hit. But it was all written on the assumption that we would hit them, and therefore we could get away with building roads because we'd be doing perfectly well on meeting our carbon budgets in other areas of policy. So this idea that we can kind of assume that we're going to do fine in other areas of policy, and therefore, all right, a few kind of exceedances of our climate change targets is all right over here on the roads programme. That's already been baked into something that was written in 2014, despite that assumption have been proved wrong, as well as being arguably illegal, and the courts will of course rule on that as to whether it is okay to ignore the 4th and 5th carbon budgets, let alone the Paris Climate Summit, all of which post-date 2014.
Okay, thanks, Roger. Well, Neil Chadwick's just got back to you with a reference, Roger, for something you should read. I'm not sure if yeah.
Could I come in here and make a request that if Dan Rittman is still with us, could he talk more about what Sustrans are proposing in terms of a hierarchy?
Hold on a minute. Is this to do with appraisal and carbon or not?
Well, Dan Rittman posted on at 2:43 p.m. He said hierarchies are middle ground between trade-offs and imperatives. For instance, Sustrans has proposed seeking to solve travel demand firstly through active travel schemes, and if that's not possible or practical, then through local public transport, and thirdly, through regional public transport, and only if none of these are workable, then through consideration of additional road capacity. I personally was unaware of this hierarchy that Sustrans have proposed, though it seems to be eminently sensible.
Okay, Dan, do you want to come in on that?
I can. Hi. Yeah. I don't actually have an awful lot to add to what I wrote. I'm not. I don't work for Sustrans. I'm at Living Streets. But I read their paper. It was. I read it in the context of this. This was one of the DFT's consultations on tag or web tag. When they were asked for kind of proposals to improve it. And I know Sustrans proposed this, and and they gave the example of. Well, they started from the point of view, I guess, that often road building schemes are the only schemes that are practically considered. And they talked about the M4 extension in South Wales. Where it was assumed that basically roads, provision of more motorway space was required to address the issue of insufficient capacity between Swansea and Cardiff, and actually. It was possible to meet that need by providing more kind of local active travel routes and public transport. So so I guess the point is that their starting point is that with with tag, it's not. It's often the case that it's not all the options are not written out, and each one is separately appraised, and then and then they're compared. People assume that the answer is going to be X or Y or Z, often roads, and built them. So this idea of a hierarchy is to is to start with the sort of least carbon intensive and for all sorts of reasons the most kind of socially beneficial methods.
Yeah. Okay.
Assess them and then move down the hierarchy, and only as a last resort look at road build.
Okay. Yeah. Martin Tugwell, England's economic heartland. You'd like to make a point?
So thank you, Andrew. So I'm going to come at this slightly differently. I'm going to have an exam question of what has COVID-19, if anything, changed? And I mean this with all sincerity, guys, the conversation we're having at the moment, to some extent, has been ongoing for quite some time. Whether we should be valuing carbon, whether we should be doing that or another. The fact of the matter is, what's going to change? So where we want to get to, has COVID-19 changed the way in which we should be approaching this? And I kind of look at it in a number of ways. What we've seen is understandably, the government lead a campaign which has had a very deep and powerful psychological impact. The message about staying at home, staying safe, and protecting NHS has really struck home with people. It's going to have consequences. We know that there will be a proportion of the population out there who will be scared senseless about using public transport moving forward. Now, for some people, and again, I kind of, with the greatest respect, kind of put this, that there's probably a lot of us on this call are going to fall into this. At the moment, working from home is okay. We can do it. There's a large part of the economy that cannot work from home. They physically cannot do their work from home. Those people are desperate to probably get back to work if they've got a job because of the economic recession that's going to hit us. So we need to be careful that we're not trying to, that we don't see this through one particular lens. And if we're talking about the economy being the key thing here, we can talk about how we substitute trips to get from where we are to where we were working. But if those business parks, if those offices have suddenly decided they're not going to invest millions of pounds a year in maintaining an office where everybody travels to, then that kind of conversation has become a bit superfluous as well. So all of this, and then I hear the argument about, oh well, it's okay, we'll have lots of local hubs and lots of local services. Well, that's great. But those services are provided by company who have probably optimized their distribution networks and their services to the point where they are at their lowest cost. And that's about centralizing distribution. So if you start decentralizing it, you might be able to have the ability for people to walk and cycle to their local shop and their local hub. But somebody's got to deliver everything to them. So there'll be more freight movements. There'll be more impact of other stuff. So I kind of say this provocatively, the question I think we have to ask ourselves is, if we have a sense of where we want to get to, how has COVID-19 made it harder or easier for us to get there? And I would come back to the psychology of people at the moment, because we are about people. The reason why transport modeling is not a science is because it's dealing with people, imperfect, irrational people. And the people that are in this country have had a very powerful shock, reinforced by some really deep, simple messaging. And that's the consequence that we need to think about when we're talking about the transport system moving forward.
Okay, what do you take a position on this idea of imperatives and whether carbon should be an imperative or whether it should be just treated alongside other objectives in appraisal?
So I personally take a view that we should treat carbon as a finite resource in the same way that we treat other things as a finite resource, whether it's financial or otherwise. But it's something that has to be thrown into the mix. And that's why I keep coming back to, this is not it's not an absolute, whoever made the comment about this is not an absolute thing, absolutely bang on. There are choices here. And the choices we're already starting to see coming through in some of the in the messaging. Why is the Chancellor and the government starting to say, do you know what, the furlough scheme is going to start unwinding sooner rather than later? The truth of the matter is this country has maxed out its credit cards to the nth degree. We cannot afford the situation we are in lasting for much longer. We have to get the economy going. People have to get used to being able to move around again. But the biggest challenge there, as I come back to, there's a large proportion of the population, many of whom actually, if I think about my own team, probably half of them are really worried about going back to work because of, if they have to use public transport, they will be worried. And so that's what we've got to think about. How does it change the debate moving forward?
Okay, thank you, Martin. Right. I wonder whether it's time to go back to Phil. You've been listening to all of that. Phil, do you think now, it's just gone 3 o'clock actually, would you like to come back in and reflect on what has been said? Hi.
Well, yes. Thank you, Andrew. If we don't get cut off by the powers that be,
No, I think you're fine.
Having outlasted our time. Just a few comments. A very interesting discussion and a very useful one. And of course, in the nature of this format, very wide-ranging, all sorts of different strands, which I would be crazy to even try to address my views on every single comment. It doesn't work. I do think it's worth reminding ourselves that among the very important central policy objectives, there are robust reasons for doing certain policies which predate coronavirus, which predate carbon crisis. There are very good reasons for seeking to reduce car ownership and car use, car traffic, and they relate not only to the environment, but they also relate to health and quality of life and simple economic efficiency. It's not an efficient way of spending large amounts of resources, obtaining the accessibility to activities and destinations and goods and services that people want. So reducing car use is a trend that will go on being discussed from the point of view of pure trade-offs and efficiency alone. And similarly, the economic inefficiency of seeking to provide for traffic, growing traffic forecasts by building road capacity to match up to them is a flawed strategy, and it was a flawed strategy 20 years ago, and it's just as much the discussion about that, I think, will go on. If coronavirus has changed anything, it's been not only in fear, but also in a simple perception that people could not conceive was possible, like having clear skies and clean air. And that has, for urban dwellers, this has provided an experience with a very strange mix of people who are undergoing terrible family and personal circumstances of health, simultaneously with people who are thinking this is an experience that I shall remember the rest of my days, how clear the skies are and how quiet the streets are. And that's changed the psychology of what things we're perhaps prepared to imagine how life should be. Mm-hmm. The narrower point I want to make is that I think I agree with Steve Gooding. Appraisal is designed to inform decisions, not make them. But precisely for that reason, if the information is incorrect, it stands in danger of misinforming the decisions. And I do think there are a whole set of reasons why this fairly new problem in terms of its salience of carbon valuation is not just a theoretical one. I just think we've got it wrong, how we've done the calculations, the way we treat marginal abatement cost, and the scale of impact that major encouragements to provisions for expansion of car use have done. And that is not a legal question, that's simply a professional question. If that ought to be changed, it ought to be changed without a court having to order us to do so. If, however, the court orders us to do so, I don't think that will be damaging at all. I think it will still be the right thing to do. I do think this sort of discussion is raising questions about the domain in which benefit cost calculations are valid. And they are not the whole life, and they're not the only way of making decisions. They're not the only way of making rational decisions. And I do think that's worth keeping in mind, that that we are not constrained by our tools, but the tools are designed to help us to do things. Thank you, Andrew, and Peter, and the LTT team for organising this discussion and the other ones. I do think it's useful.
Well, I'd like to thank you, Phil, for coming up with the topic, and I think there's a lot of meat in this discussion that we've probably not drilled down into, and we could have even talked about electric cars and all that. I think that's the government's line, isn't it? That because all traffic's going to be electrified, we can continue building roads. I wonder, that's probably the start of another hour's discussion. Not perhaps for now. But no, thank you for this, because I think it's good, and it's taken it beyond. You've written a couple of pieces for LTT recently, which have been in this territory, and this has certainly taken it forward a bit. So thanks a lot. Do we give a round of applause again? I don't know, a visual one from. Thank you. Shall I just go back to Peter now? Peter, it's 3:10. I don't know whether you want to take this forward. I'm probably going to go and do a bit of editing.
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. Very good again. Well done for the interrogation you've done. And I was commenting privately that it's like the BBC when they can't get the minister, they get the ex-minister. And you having Steve Gooding under the cosh there is the next thing to asking what the hell's going on in the DFC. So that was well done, and thanks for all of the contributors as well. And we got the chat, which I will keep for later, so we can dig into some of the thoughts that people have posted for future discussions. And of course, thanks to Phil, who I think is adapting to the new format, because he's a main man for guest lectures on provocative subjects. Many times I've sat in the hall at UCL or at the ICE or anywhere else to hear him, and doing it online is a challenge. So well done, Phil, for being the first speaker who's done the full Monty presentation at the beginning of one of our chats. We can stay around. I think the number's down to 30 odd now. There's a few one-to-ones I end up doing at the end of these things, and so if anybody wants, I'll keep the channel open, and if people just want to do informal stuff, that's fine, and I'll be here if anybody wants to talk to me. We've got another one in 2 weeks' time. That's going to be on the Friday, and we're going to tackle this issue of road space reallocation and street level changes, whilst the opportunities there due to lower traffic and the consciousness of the separation that needs to be in place for the virus and some of the climate issues. So we've got a panel of practitioners and specialists in street level traffic changes. There's some good stuff going on. You've covered some of it in the magazine, Andrew, and I'm always interested in examples of where local authorities have been proactive to take advantage of opportunities. I think Brighton's a good example where there's been some road closures done, and I think the DFT regulations have been more flexible at the moment. So we'll be tackling that in 2 weeks' time, and I've got a few other things up my sleeve for the next fortnights afterwards, but if anybody's got any ideas, please let me know. Right, so Andrew, I can let you go off and prepare the magazine. And I'll stay here myself, and if anybody wants to be involved in any conversation, please continue. I'll see, we're down to, yeah, it's dropping off fast now. That's something I said, I think. Yeah, does anybody want to say anything in general terms about life, the universe and the future?
Just say I've got to now go and do my parental duties or proxy parental duties. So I'll say with that, goodbye. Cheers.
Thanks a lot, bye. Who can I see here who I'd like to talk to? I'm just looking at the list.
Can I just, if Tim is still there?
Tim is still here, I think, yeah.
Can you, I don't know your website to your website to find those criteria, because in fact, I think they were they came from politicians, but they did work. And if we had that to assess the National Road Programme, we probably wouldn't have it, and we'd have all the potholes mended instead.
Yes, it was by invitation of the terrible two under Ken Livingstone, the two,
Dave Wetzel and Paul Moore.
Dave Wetzel and Paul Moore, because we'd been quite prominent in fighting the ringways. The ringways were cancelled, but there remained this huge legacy of schemes on the GLC's books. And when they came into County Hall, Dave and Paul, they didn't know what to do. There were all these highway engineers saying, we've got to do this and we've got to do that. So they came to me and said, how should we trim this list down? So I bashed it off, and there it is. And actually, on the copy that I put on the website, it includes not only what I wrote, but also what the GLC deleted before approving it at committee. So it's quite an interesting historic thing. My website is livingtransport.com.
Living Transport.
Can I ask a question about that, please? Steve Bishop from Steer, and I put a comment in the chat section, but as transport planners, or if we identify as transport planners, we've identified many of the crimes that we commit through misuse of appraisal, and as well as some of the genuine challenges of DFT appraisal processes. But the thing we keep coming back to is this idea of imperatives rather than monetized impacts, and that what we put into the sausage machine of appraisal is wrong in the first place. So we identify schemes in search of a problem or a narrative. But then, and back to sort of David Metz's point earlier, that we also still work in silos, so that why aren't we, do we have the right tools to compare digital infrastructure or integrated planning approaches or things that might facilitate or reduce the need to travel in the first place with transport interventions? And it just strikes me that if we are to work cross-silo, if we are to get the right interventions in the first place, does government at different scales have the right tools, particularly quantitative or analytical tools, to get good strategy and good sort of short lists of interventions before we start committing crimes with appraisal?
Well, I agree with that.
Nice one.
I would only just say that what I did back in 1981 was very much somebody pressing my button and me splurging out what I thought at the time. It wasn't considered really, other than, as John Elliott quite rightly said, it was a set of filters, which basically, I suppose, is the scheme going to make the problems you're trying to solve worse, or is it going to make them better? Or can you modify the scheme in order that it does make them better? So it was quite a simple filtering, really. It wasn't an appraisal method as such. It was a set of policy filters, if you like.
Exactly. I think a lot of us will have developed multi-criteria assessment frameworks that do just that, rather than try to score and rank. They're filters. We look at the extent to which different interventions across a broad spectrum of policy areas meet different criteria. But what we end up doing is making a more qualitative assessment about the interventions that should go into our plans or strategies. What we struggle to then do is back that up with an analytical assessment, because we find going into strategic outline business cases in the early stages of WebTag too expensive and too costly, and it's too scheme-based. And are there analytical tools that help get the right strategy in the first place?
Stephen, I think it's really useful. I saw your comment earlier, and I'm pleased you came in with it, although we're down to the last hardcore group. I'd like to run with that, if we could, in LTT sometime. I'll perhaps talk separately about how you could give your broader view on it. It struck me the point you're making is the issue is not the outcome of the process, it's the initiation of the process. And we're always desperate about outcomes. You know, what should we do and how can we justify? But what we've really got to do is reflect upon where we start from. Now, there was a couple of highly philosophical points in the chat about, I think the one is the John Dale's mentioned about the environment is the first thing to think about and the economics follow, rather than we're in an economic world and everything we have to do starts with an economic imperative of one kind. I mean, I'm not saying I subscribe to that, but that's the philosophers and the kind of a religious approach to life is that, you know, you start with a set of really important criteria and then you build on it. If you went to the Shaker community in, I don't know which state it is, but I mean, they start with an absolutely clear statement of how they're going to live, and then they build from that. Now, we don't seem to have that discussion that much. We just stampede forwards all the time. I thought this interruption in normal life might allow us to do the reflective bit. We are doing some of it here, but I mean, how long can that last for before we're all back to let's build it and they will come approach to life? Anything from you on that?
From me, I mean, I completely agree. It's almost the longer lockdown goes on, more some of these positive secondary behaviours and outcomes we're identifying might endure. Almost the quicker lockdown is released, the less they will. But it still goes back to my point. I think we're all capable of thinking cross-policy, cross-sector, and doing the qualitative thinking about the world we want to live in. This sort of almost kind of plan and provide, as opposed to forecast or vision and validate, as we might want to call it. It's just the analytical tools to support it before we get into transport analysis guidance from DFT.
That's right. Nicola, I can see you're theoretically here. Are you here?
I am, sorry, I've been very quiet.
All right, well, look, lovely to have you. I mean, you've been grappling with some of these issues in the planning, strategic planning tasks you've got for Greater Manchester. I mean, you presented at one of our summits, and we've been in touch since about how you've taken the message to the public and the various interest groups. I mean, are you thinking you're going to have to revise all this now?
No. well, we're doing a range of scenario planning at the moment to see how it. Well, how long these impacts might last and what effect they might have on the ambitions that we set out in 2040 and the degree. Well, okay, we've come to quite a few similar conclusions to Phil in terms of there's sort of divergent impacts. I think some very helpful trends that might be accelerated and others which might pull in the opposite direction. So we're doing a lot of thinking at the moment about how much does this fundamentally affect the sorts of interventions we're going to be publishing later this year.
Sorry, and your mayor is not backward in coming forward about this.
He's not, no, and he's very focused on the Build Back Better kind of approach to life, which I don't necessarily love that term, but it's I think it's quite a nice way of thinking about how we can not just go back to exactly how things were, but that there are not opportunities as such, but there are trends here which we might want to build on, and others which are going to cause real challenges, particularly around public transport, as Phil mentioned before.
I can imagine. I mean, is there anything specific in this scenario painting that you can put in about public transport in the next 12 months, 18 months? Have you got a take on that yet?
We have. It's very much sort of in development stages, but happy to pick that up with you once we've given it a little bit more more airing. Yeah,
it's important, isn't it? Because
yeah.
And not only is it about transport, but the economic implications of it being an unsustainable model trigger all sorts of other discussions about who provides what to who and gets paid for it. You know, that's an amazing unfinished agenda. Anybody else left on the list here who'd like to say anything? I'll wind up in a few minutes. But
yeah, Peter, I do have to dash now, but thank you very much for organising this, and thanks for everyone's contributions. So bye for now. Have a pleasant long weekend.
See you, Stephen. Thanks. Richard Walker.
Hello.
You came to our party wearing your Bible bashing hat. I noticed this afternoon. I don't know if it was
No, I was just teasing Neil.
I know.
I wondered, is it worth whoever's left in the chat just quickly brainstorming what shall we talk about in the future, or not really?
Well, I mean, I'm interested always to use this as a sort of thing that we would do if we bumped into each other in a pub, and you wouldn't know what you're going to talk about, would you? And after every conference I go to, I always look forward to anybody going for a drink sort of stuff.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure what we would be talking about if we were propping up the bar in St. Stephen's Tavern at the moment or something, you know. Anybody got any thoughts on what might be on the radar?
Well, I mean, I've got some thoughts, but I'll let others go first.
Yeah, anybody want to say what they think I should be thinking about in terms of a discussion that hasn't happened yet?
The seagull wants to come in.
Come in on that one.
I think there is more to be had on this topic generally of appraisal and getting policies right and evidence-based policies. I think one of the basic troubles of national networks policy statement was it wasn't properly evidence-based, but billions are being spent on it. Sorry, I'm on my pet hobby horse, but so many of the road schemes are approaching towns, big towns, where we know that it will increase commuting. And I think there's more to be had on this area, but how do you persuade politicians that there is the evidence?
I'll throw something at you, you know, just from what you said. If we had a whole discussion on commuting, right? Just like, this afternoon we're doing an hour on commuting. Now, the interesting thing is, in my head, and probably wrongly, it's based upon the old Cat Stevens, Matthew and Son lyrics of people getting trains at 8:17, you know, all that stuff. Now, that's an old-fashioned view of commuting, isn't it? I mean, for heaven's sake, how many people use the same train every day to go to the same destination, you know, and provide that requirement on a train or a bus that is used daily? I don't know, but I'm suspecting it's not now the dominant part of it. Then we've got all this key worker stuff, working all sorts of weird hours, you know, going to the warehouse at 10 o'clock at night and night shifts at the hospital. I know there was some work done on commuting a few years ago, but I mean, it must be well out of date now. I mean, does anybody have a clue what these journey to work kind of subtleties are going to be like going forward?
I don't have a clue, but I just observed that the people doing the same trip are underpinned the funding model. So, you know, the thing was that even though people weren't making the same trip every day, Monday to Friday. They were funding the rail network from the season tickets sold, you know. And as people were starting to complain, saying, I only go into the office 3 days a week, but I've still got to buy a season ticket. And the reason that the rail industry wasn't saying, oh yeah, let's move to a carnet system, was that it would just put a massive hole in the finances, you know. So all I'm saying is that what we think of as our rail system is kind of propped up by assumptions about commuting in many respects, and also assumptions about business travel, Peter, I think.
Yeah.
Which are now shot to pieces, you know.
But who's the thinking man's thinker on this one? I mean, it might have been Phil, but he chooses his subjects over the years. He goes from road pricing to climate to appraisal. I mean, who? It
used to be Cornby, didn't it? Cornby used to do he did the future long distance travel.
Well, I'm interested in the socio-psychological thing about the idea of commuting. I mean, the pattern of the journey, the regular concept of the original commute, which was into the big city in the morning, concentrated in, an hour or two, and coming home slightly wider spread. The inbound is usually more peaked than the outbound. But that's what commuting is, and I'm sure if we went to the popular medium, they'd say, oh, here's a commuter. He's just getting off the train at Waterloo. It's 5 to 10 in the morning or whatever it is. And that's the commuter, right? But that is probably a very distorting concept now about how people get to their work.
You're talking about the breakdown in the uniformity of the travel pattern. Yeah. I mean, I remember those classic bits of footage of London Bridge. Not only were they all traveling at the same time, but they were all dressed exactly the same way.
And now when I do it, I'm the only one wearing a hat.
They used to call them the bowler hat brigade.
That's right. Anyway, a thought there. No one's risen to it, but if anybody...
No, I think I would support a close look at the changing patterns, and also there are surveys being done which reveal now how people are regarding the future. When they're not some sort of working normality returns. There's already surveys showing how people are anticipating that they won't be traveling as much to work and will be working more at home and at local hubs. So we're already getting that kind of information.
Well, I mean, the other person who, I'm thinking back, I'm looking for my experts here. Stephen Potter at the Open University used to devour statistics on this sort of stuff, didn't he? I mean, who now could I turn to and say, look, I'll give you a month, do a bit of digging around and come and lead a discussion on commuter and journey to work patterns? Tim, you're on. Do it.
What about the Commission on Travel Demand, Peter?
Ah, yes. Well, you've got friends there in high places.
There's a whole commission's worth of them, isn't there?
Yeah. I'll go. Is that still ticking over?
I think it's brought to life as and when they feel like bothering. Resist.
But actually, I was very intrigued because actually. It's a long time since I've heard all these, professional expert opinions debating this kind of subject. But I actually was, I was very intrigued when finally somebody made the point that actually this started out as a discussion about COVID-19. And a lot of what was discussed actually was just like listening to something that could have happened before COVID-19. And one of my questions is that the phrase that's now used a lot is the new normal. Yeah, and the key word there is normal. What is normal? And I'm thinking back to the fact that last summer, I live on the other side of the channel. I'm in Brussels here, and we had a summer that was not normal. I mean, it was abnormal. The temperature in Europe, in this part of Europe, exceeded 40 degrees centigrade. And I think that COVID-19 has raised so many questions about what is this normality? What is this window that we're actually, I wrote on the chat line, is there a window of opportunity here for policymakers to say, okay, we're not going into a new or returning to normality, as if somehow that is an objective, to return to what is normal. And I mean, I was very interested by a lot of the comments, but as somebody who spent most of their time talking to people about transport and mobility rather than, I have my childcare duties to go to in a moment, but I really do think, what do we mean by normal in this context? You talked about commuting, who is the normal commuter? Well, COVID-19 is changing that in so many different ways and across different segments of society. I think we shouldn't forget that the impact of this is very different on lower income groups as against, I was actually very intrigued to see all the offices and the environments that people sit in, whether I'm watching TV and politicians and seeing their spare bedroom, on these Zoom discussions. It's very different for different segments of the population, the return to normality or a new normality. And that's basically what I wanted to say.
Tim, did
yes.
you join either of our two previous discussions?
No, I wasn't invited.
Oh, I'm sorry. Well,
but that's fine.
We did explore some of that landscape there, and we will again.